The machine gun opened fire from the ridge, its bullets shattering the granite beside my face. I was flat on my belly in the slush, my hands clawing at the stone. I had no ammunition left in my rifle. 10 yards away, a dead German lay in the snow, a full cartridge belt still wrapped around his waist. If I didn't reach that belt, we were dead. As I dragged myself forward, my fingers brushed the pocket of my coat, touching the small lump of salt I'd brought from home, already melting in the wet cold. I didn't know it yet, but this mountain would dissolve more than just that salt. It would take everything we crossed the sea to protect. We did not start on this mountain, under this freezing fire. Just 3 weeks ago, we were boarding the British troop ships in France, our clean French uniforms smelling of bleach and mothballs, our hearts beating with the hope of showing the world that Poland was still standing. They put us on the water, thousands of us in the cold holds, heading north toward a place we couldn't even find on a map. When the anchor finally dropped, we looked out into a gray wall of vertical stone rising straight from the black water of the fjord at Harstad. I stood on the wet deck under a freezing drizzle that never seemed to stop, wondering if we had sailed off the edge of the world. I still didn't know how we would ever climb those walls or what was waiting for us at the top. Before the war, my world had walls too, but they were made of solid salt. Back in Wieliczka, I spent my teen years hundreds of feet below the grass, carving out white blocks in the deep, heavy dark of the mines. Down there, the dark was quiet and safe. It wrapped around me like a thick coat, and I always knew where the ceiling ended. There were no winds in the salt chambers, no sudden flashes of light, only the steady, comforting thump of the iron picks and the smell of dry dust. But here in Norway, the sky has no roof, and the sheer emptiness of the vertical space makes my stomach turn. I kept a small lump of Wieliczka salt in my pocket, a secret anchor to the solid earth that I never told my comrades. I had no idea how quickly that salt would melt in the Norwegian rain. The landing craft groaned against the steel side of the troop ship as the winch lowered us into the choppy swell. The freezing drizzle had turned into a stinging sleet that whipped our faces and coated our Adrian helmets in a thin sheet of ice. We huddled together, 30 men to a boat, our heavy Bergen's packs pressing us down, making us feel like cattle headed for the slaughter. I could hear the teeth of Stas Zyba chattering next to me, a fast, rhythmic clicking that sounded like a broken typewriter. He was only 19, a boy from Krakow who had never seen the sea, and his hands were clamped so hard on the barrel of his MAS-36 rifle that his knuckles were white. Above the roar of the diesel engine, a sharp, metallic screech echoed from the harbor entrance. It was the siren of a British destroyer, warning of bombers. We couldn't see them through the thick, low clouds, but we could hear the high-pitched, synchronized drone of the twin engines coming from the south. The anti-aircraft guns on the ships began to thump, their black puffs of smoke appearing like dirty smudges against the gray sky. A bomb fell somewhere in the bay, throwing up a huge column of black water that sprayed over our boat, freezing on our wool capes. The officers shouted at us to keep our heads down, promising us that the Royal Navy would keep the sky clean. We were told the British Navy ruled these waters, but the burning timber of a supply ship near the quay suggested otherwise. We scrambled out of the boats onto the rocky shore, our boots slipping on the wet shale. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke from the ships and the rotten tang of seaweed. The officers didn't let us rest. They pushed us immediately into a column, marching us toward the base of the mountains. The path was narrow, a muddy track cut into the stone, slick with melting snow. Each step was a battle against our own gear. The French wool coats were heavy and soaked up the rain like sponges, and the Bergen's packs cut deep into our shoulders. I had told my mother in my last letter from France that we would be home by summer. Staring up at the frozen, jagged peaks, I realized I had signed a contract with a ghost. Corporal Felix Felo Dombrowski led our file, his Podhale cape flapping in the wind. He was 24, a mountain guide from Zakopane who who knew the high slopes better than any of us. But this Arctic air was different from the Tatras. Every 100 yards, he had to stop to muffle a wet cough into his collar, his face turning red. He wouldn't let anyone carry his load, though. Whenever Stas tried to reach for his pack, Felo would bark at him. Felo stopped near a sharp bend in the trail, looking up at the gray mist hanging over the ridge above us, his teeth clenched. "Those Alpine troops don't slide," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They wait." Next to me, Stas was scratching his right earlobe, his fingers tracing the jagged shrapnel scar he'd brought from Poland. He wouldn't look up at the mountain, keeping his eyes locked onto Felo's heels. Stas was a city boy used to the narrow streets of Krakow, where the brick walls were close enough to touch, and this vast open sky was driving him mad. "Krakow had walls," he whispered, his voice trembling as the wind tore through his coat. "But here there is nothing to keep the wind from pulling you into the empty air." He shivered, his eyes darting to the empty white slopes that seemed to go on forever, as if he expected the sky itself to fall and crush him. The wind died down for a second, and in that sudden silence, we heard the first sharp crack of a sniper's rifle. We threw ourselves down, helmets clattering against the stone. The bullet chipped the rock inches from Stas's shoulder. Felo was already crawling forward, his rifle held low against the snow, his eyes scanning the gray boulders above us. Stas lay frozen, his chest heaving, his fingers dug deep into the wet shale. I pulled him behind a low outcrop, but he wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the empty sky. Up on the ridge, the sniper fired again, the bullet snapping through the air with a hiss. We were pinned in the open. I checked my rifle chamber. Only 4 rounds left. Felo crawled forward, working his way around the outcrop. He signaled me to watch the ridge, then fired a shot toward a dark cleft. The blast was deafening in the narrow pass. The sniper didn't answer. We ran, crouched low, until we reached the shadow of a larger ridge that offered some cover. Stas was still shaking, his hand scratching his ear scar until it bled. I wanted to ask Felo if we were going to survive, but the look in his eyes stopped me. The light began to fail, but it was not the clean, dark night I knew from the mines. In the Arctic, the sun simply slides along the horizon, casting long blue shadows that paint the snow in a sickly cold light. The temperature plummeted, freezing the slush on our uniforms until they became stiff and crackled with every step. My feet were numb, the steel studs on my soles sliding on the ice as we climbed higher into the Ankenes Peninsula. We could see the lights of Narvik across the fjord, a small, dark cluster of roofs that looked close enough to touch, yet completely out of reach. Below us, the black water of the Fjord was dotted with the gray shapes of Allied warships, their smokestacks cold and silent. I wondered if my brother was down there on one of those ships, looking up at the mountains, thinking I was safe on the rocks. We finally reached the outpost, a shallow line of trenches scraped into the scree on Hill 275. It was nothing like the neat sandbagged positions we'd trained in back in France. Here, the ground was too hard to dig, and the trenches were just low walls of loose stone piled up to chest height. The Polish soldiers already there looked like ghosts, their faces hollowed out by hunger and the constant wind, their wool capes stiff with frozen mud. They didn't speak to us when we crawled into the line. They just stared with empty eyes, their hands wrapped around the metal receivers of their rifles to keep them from freezing. We dropped our heavy packs into the slush, our muscles burning from the climb. One of the veterans, a sergeant with a gray beard and a torn uniform, pointed toward a small, soot-stained tin heated by a tiny blue flame. We had come to fight for the future of our nation, but our immediate world had shrunk to a tiny blue flame warming a dirty tin. I took the tin from the stove, the metal burning my numb fingers even through my wool gloves. I drank, and the taste of bitter rock dust mixed with dry coal smoke from the trioxane tablet coated my tongue, leaving a dry metallic film that made my throat tighten. It was warm, but it tasted of ashes and stone, a miserable brew that offered no real relief. I passed the tin to Stas, who took a small sip and immediately choked, coughing the gray water over his knees. Phalo grabbed the tin next, drinking it down in 3 long gulps before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes fixed on the dark ridge above us. We had only 3 tins of fuel left to melt our water, and the sun wouldn't show its face for another 18 hours. Stas huddled in the corner of the stone wall, his hands locked over his ears, his eyes wide as he stared at the pale sky. The clouds had parted, exposing the peak to a cold silver light that reflected off the white slopes with a blinding glare. He was trembling so hard that his helmet knocked against the stone behind him with a small, rhythmic rattle. "There's no place to go," he whispered, his chest heaving as he tried to compress his body into the smallest possible space. "If they look down, they can see us. They can see everything." Phalo didn't look at him, but his hand tightened on his rifle barrel. I had told Stas back in France that we would be safe on the heights, but here, every foot of granite was a target. The silence on Hill 275 was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on our chests. We sat in the freezing slush, our ears strained for any sound from the peaks above us. The Germans were up there, hidden in the crevices of Hill 650, waiting for the order to sweep us off the slopes. We could hear the occasional crunch of boots on the loose stone, a sound that seemed to float down through the cold air, making us freeze in place. Stas clenched his teeth to keep them from chattering, his knuckles white on his stock. Phalo leaned against the rocks, his hood pulled low, his wet cough rattling in his chest like loose gravel. I still don't know if the firing pin would work when the metal was this cold, and I didn't want to find out the hard way. The mountain did not warn us. Just as Stas finished speaking, the ridge exploded. A mortar shell landed directly on our stone parapet, collapsing the wall in a flash of heat and flying shale. The shock wave slammed me backward, burying my legs in loose stone. I didn't search for my helmet or listen for commands. I just lunged through the dust to grab Stas by his collar, dragging him out of the collapsing crevice before a second shell obliterated the spot where he had been shivering. Phalo was already on his feet, firing the light machine gun into the dark. The receiver of my rifle was frozen stiff, the bolt locked by ice. I hammered it open with the heel of my palm, chambered a round, and fired blindly into the gray snow. There was no plan, no orders, just 3 men firing into the dark, praying the German infantry wouldn't reach our ledge before the dust settled. The mortar barrage finally subsided as the dawn broke, leaving us shivering in the freezing gravel. That first night's terror was just a taste of what was to come. The cold on the ridges of Ankenes did not just bite, it settled into the marrow, a heavy, dull ache that never left. Below my boots, the granite was slick, a wet black skin covered in a treacherous mush of melting snow and mud. Every single step was a silent struggle against gravity. The steel studs on the soles of my French mountain boots screeched against the bare stone, slipping on the wet shale as I tried to hold my footing. We had been on this pass for 5 days, but time had stopped moving up here. It just froze, thawed, and froze again, leaving us trapped in a gray, vertical world. I stared down at my hands. They were raw. The skin split into red, stinging grooves around the knuckles where the wind had chapped them raw. Back in Poland, in the salt chambers of Wieliczka, 300 meters below the green fields, my hands had been dry. The salt would sting if I cut my skin, but the air down there was thick, warm, and constant. The dark of the mine was a solid thing. It felt like a heavy woolen blanket, protecting me from the chaos of the world above. Here, the dark was thin, pierced by a wind that roared off the North Sea, whipping through the narrow passes and carrying the smell of salt water and ice. Up here, there was nothing between a man and the sky. Stas huddled next to me in our shallow trench. We had scraped it out of the hard shale with our small entrenching tools, and our bare fingers, piling the loose stones in front of us to make a low, jagged wall. It was not enough to stop a rifle bullet, but it kept the wind from tearing the skin off our faces. Between us, a small soot-stained tin can sat on a flat rock. Inside, a chunk of gray snow was slowly turning to water over a trioxane fuel tablet. The blue chemical flame flickered in the draft, hissing as small drops of water spilled over the side. I watched the snow melt. It was a slow, agonizing process. The water was never clean. It always carried a thin film of gray soot and the gritty dust of the stone we had disturbed. When I took a sip from the tin, it tasted of bitter rock dust and dry coal smoke. The chemical fuel left a greasy coating on the roof of my mouth. It did not quench the thirst, but it was warm. It was the only warm thing we had in this desolate wilderness. Phalo was leaning against the stone wall, his cloak pulled tight around his neck. The heavy wool was damp, smelling of old mud. He did not look at the water. He was staring at his hands, rubbing his palms together. It was his way of proving to himself that the cold had not yet taken his fingers. His chest rose, and then he let out a hollow, wet cough. He pressed his face into his cloak, trying to smother the noise, but his shoulders shook with the violence of the fit. When he pulled his head back, he wiped his lips with the back of his sleeve. "The wind is shifting," Phalo whispered, his voice raw. "It's coming from the south now. That means more wet snow." "Let it snow," Stas muttered. "The snow covers the rocks. When the snow is gone, there is too much space. There is nothing to hide under." He kept his eyes on the gray void, completely blind to the silent movement in the rocks just 50 yards above our heads. The sun did not really set. It just dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in long, cold shadows of violet and blue. The light stayed, a pale, ghostly glow that kept us awake and exposed. Stas lay on his side, his knees pulled up to his chest, his hands locked over his ears. He was shivering, but it was not the cold. His teeth clicked together like dry pebbles in a jar. "Stas?" I said, leaning over to touch his shoulder. He flinched, as if I had struck him with a rifle butt. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat, despite the freezing air. "It's too light, Janusz," he whispered. "It's like standing in a shooting gallery. There is nothing above us to keep them from looking straight down." "They aren't looking at you," Phalo said, his hand resting on the receiver of his rifle. "They're looking for the British ships. Now keep your head down." Phalo did not have time to finish. A sudden sharp hiss broke the silence of the pass. A German magnesium flare shot up from the high rocks of Hill 650, trailing a thin ribbon of white smoke before it burst into a brilliant, blinding light. The white glare washed over the mountainside, turning the snow into a flat, dead sheet and casting long black shadows that stretched down the slope like reaching fingers. Stas gasped. He did not move. He froze, his body locking up as the light exposed every crack in our shallow stone wall. His hands stayed clamped over his ears, his eyes staring wide at the burning white star hanging in the air. He was completely paralyzed, unable to duck, unable to crawl. His breath came in short, jagged whistles. I grabbed the collar of his woolen cloak and pulled him down into the dirt. He was stiff, his muscles hard as wood. "Get down," I growled in his ear, my face pressed against the wet stone dust. "Don't look at it. It's looking at me," he whimpered. His face was buried in my shoulder, his fingers digging into the heavy wool of my Podhale cloak. "It's looking right at me." Phalo did not move either, but he was not frozen by fear. He was struggling to breathe. The cold air, thick with the chemical smell of the burning magnesium, hit his lungs. He doubled over, his forehead pressing into the snow as a fresh fit of coughing racked his thin frame. He clutched his chest, his face turning a deep, dark purple in the white light of the flare. He tried to choke the sound back, burying his mouth in his sleeve, but the wet, rattling cough echoed off the rock face behind us. The flare slowly drifted down, sputtering and dying in the slush. The dark rushed back, heavier and colder than before. Felo lay in the mud, his chest heaving, a thin line of dark saliva running from the corner of his mouth. He did not speak, he just pulled his cloak tighter and closed his eyes. We waited for the mortar shells that usually followed the flares, but the mountain remained silent. The only sound was the wind and the dry scraping sound of Felo's labored breathing. "We have to get him down to the beach," I said to Stas, my voice low. "If that cough doesn't kill him, the Germans will hear it. It's like a bell ringing in the dark." Stas did not answer. He was still trembling in the dark. He stared at the spot where the flare had died, as if waiting for the sky to fall. I reached into my Bergens pack and pulled out our last ration, a small square tin of French beef. The metal was cold enough to stick to my skin. I used the flat blade of my bayonet to pry the lid open. The fat inside had congealed into a white, waxy crust, but we did not have the fuel to melt it. I scraped a small portion out with my thumb and handed it to Stas. He took it without looking, shoving it into his mouth and chewing slowly, his jaw moving like a machine. "I didn't join to fight for the Republic," Stas said suddenly. The grease from the beef was shiny on his chin. "My father had a harness shop in Krakow, a harness shop. He used to beat me with the stirrup straps until the skin on my back was the color of a beet. I ran to France because I wanted to get away from him." He paused, looking down at his dirty hands. "I thought if I went to war, I'd be a soldier. I thought there'd be walls, a barracks. Now I'm up here, and there's nothing but the wind." I looked at Felo, who had stopped coughing and lay too still in the shadow of the ledge. I wanted to ask him if he could feel his feet, but I was too afraid of what he might say. The dawn came without a sun. The sky just turned from a deep charcoal to a thin, watery gray. The wind had dropped, leaving the pass in a heavy, cold silence that felt more dangerous than the gale. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the stone beneath my knees. It was not the sound of artillery. It was the deep, heavy rumble of marine engines. I crawled to the edge of the cliff, pushing my head past a low boulder to look down into the narrow strip of water below us. The Rombox Fjord lay 300 feet down, a dark, narrow mirror wedged between the vertical mountain walls. In the center of the dark water, the sleek silhouette of a destroyer cut a clean white wake through the gray surface. It was the ORP Grom. Even from this height, I could see the Polish flag flying from her stern, a small patch of red and white moving against the black water. She was firing her anti-aircraft guns, the small muzzle flashes blinking like fireflies along her deck. "Is that the Grom?" Stas asked, crawling up beside us. His voice was small, but the terror was gone, replaced by a sudden, desperate hope. "It's her," I said. My heart hammered against my ribs. "She's been patrolling the fjord since Tuesday." My brother, Tadeusz, was down there. He was a stoker, working in the hot, oil-slick belly of the ship. Before we boarded the transports in France, he had taken a small bottle of white lead paint and painted a crude Polish eagle on the front of my French helmet. So the Germans know who shot them. He had laughed, his face smeared with grease. I could still feel the weight of his hand on my shoulder. The sky above the fjord suddenly erupted. 3 German Heimkel bombers dropped out of the low clouds, their twin engines roaring as they dived toward the narrow water. They looked like gray hawks circling a fish. The Grom twisted, her rudder hard over as she tried to dodge the shadow of the peaks, her guns spitting a steady stream of fire into the gray air. Then came the flash. It was a silent, blinding yellow bloom that erupted from the middle of the ship, just behind the second funnel. A fraction of a second later, the sound hit us, a deep, hollow roar that shook the ledge we clung to. The blast wave rolled up the mountain, carrying a hot gust of wind that smelled of cordite and burnt paint. The ship did not slide. She broke. The midsection vanished in a cloud of dirty gray smoke and orange fire. Within seconds, her bow rose straight out of the water, a black finger pointing at the sky, before she began to slide backward into the freezing depths of the fjord. The water around her boiled with white foam and the black, greasy slick of marine oil. I stood up. I did not think about the German snipers on the peaks or the open sky. I just stood on the edge of the cliff, my hands clutching the rough stone, watching the water swallow the ship. It took less than 3 minutes. The red and white flag was the last thing to disappear beneath the gray water. A thick, black column of marine oil smoke rose from the spot where the ship had been. It drifted up the cliffs, slow and heavy, wrapping around the cliffs like a funeral shroud. The smell hit us a minute later, a distinct, greasy stench of burning oil and scorched iron that settled in the back of my throat. It tasted of heavy oil smoke and salt, but it was worse than the trioxane. It was the smell of Tadeusz's grave. Felo reached up and grabbed the hem of my Podhale cloak, pulling me back down into the dirt. "Janusz," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Get down. You can't help him. Nobody can help them now." I sat in the wet slush, my back against the rock. My hands were shaking. I touched the front of my helmet, where the hand-painted eagle was cold and rough under my fingertips. The white paint was already chipping, showing the dark French steel beneath. We were cut off. The sea had been our only link to the world we had lost, the only road back to Poland. Now, that road was 300 feet deep in the Arctic ice. "He was down in the boilers," I whispered. My throat was dry, the words scraping like sand. "He never even saw the sky." Stas did not look at me. He was staring at the black smoke that was still rising from the fjord, his face blank. The ship was gone, and with it, the last illusion that we were an army. We were just 3 men freezing on a rock, waiting for our turn to die. We stayed in the crevice for hours, the greasy smell of the oil lingering in our uniforms. The wind returned, tearing at the smoke and scattering it across the peaks, but the smell did not leave. It seemed to have soaked into the wool of our cloaks. In the afternoon, the corporal ordered a patrol along the lower ridge to check the wire. My legs felt like lead, but I stood up, hooking my MAS-36 rifle over my shoulder. The metal of the receiver was cold enough to bite through my wool mittens. We moved in a single line, keeping close to the rock face, our boots crunching through the fresh sleet. The slope was littered with the debris of the earlier fighting, shattered wooden crates, empty brass casings, and frozen scraps of gray German wool. As I stepped over a deep crevice filled with slush, something caught my eye, a small, bright circle of silver reflecting the pale light. I bent down and brushed the wet snow away. It was a silver pocket watch attached to a broken steel chain. The casing was engraved with a hand-painted Polish eagle, scratched crudely over a faded German name, a relic of the September campaign, looted by some German soldier in Poland before he was sent to these northern ridges. I pressed the latch, and the lid popped open. The glass was cracked, but the hands were still moving. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was tiny, but in the cold silence of the ridge, it sounded like a hammer. It was a relic of our lost home, carried by the enemy and lost in the retreat. The German who took it was probably dead, but the watch was still counting the seconds of our war. I wound the stem 3 times, feeling the spring tighten under my thumb. The watch said it was 1420. If the British supply boats did not arrive by 1500, we would have to face the night with 5 rounds of ammunition per man. The boats never came. As the shadows lengthened into another freezing twilight, we knew the night would bring the storm we couldn't outrun. The twilight was dropping fast, wrapping the peaks in a dull gray haze that smelled of frozen shale. I touched the small lump of Wieliczka salt in my pocket. It was mostly damp mush now, melting away under the wet wool. In the valley below, the wind howling off the Bice Fjord carried the faint, greasy stench of burning marine oil, a reminder that the sea was already swallowing our fleet. We huddled in our wool capes, the traditional dark cloaks of the Podhale mountain brigades, trying to keep the wind from freezing the sweat on our necks. Stas was huddled next to me in a shallow gap between two ledges. His fingers were raw, scratching at the scar on his right earlobe. His eyes were wide, locked onto the low-hanging clouds. Every time the wind shrieked through the rocks, he flinched. He was only 19, but his face had the hollow, gray look of an old man. I didn't answer him. I was busy checking my rifle. General Bohu Shishko had nearly 5,000 of us scattered across these heights, but the supply lines from the beach were thin, and we were running out of ammunition. Down by the water, the French and the Foreign Legion were throwing themselves against the docks. But up here, we were on our own, holding the ridges with whatever we had in our packs. Then the birds stopped. Every one of the gulls that had been circling the burning oil in the fjord below vanished into the rocks. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring before a cave-in. A high, thin whistle cut through the wind. It was a sound we had learned to dread in the valleys of France, and it sounded no better here. Mortars. The first shells slammed into the ridge below us, spraying the ledge with dirt and stone splinters. The blast sent a shower of gravel over my helmet, chipping the paint of the Polish Eagle badge. In the smoke, the dry rattle of a German machine gun began to chew the air. They were starting their push, climbing through the mist. Corporal Felix Felo Dombrowski was crouched to our right, trying to muffle a wet cough into his heavy coat. Even with the shrapnel singing overhead, he reached down to tighten his bootlaces. He always did that, claiming a soldier couldn't fight with loose boots. Those bastards on the ridge aren't retreating, Felo growled, spitting a red glob into the snow. He pointed toward the flanking ridge. Keep that MAS-36 moving, Janusz. If they gain the high ground, we're done. I raised my rifle, aiming at the gray shapes climbing through the birch scrub and the melting snow. I squeezed the trigger. The MAS-36 kicked, the sharp crack of the 7.5mm round echoing off the stone walls of the ravine. I worked the dog-leg bolt, the hot brass casing leaping out and hissing as it hit the wet slush. Over on the left, our squad's FM-2429 light machine gun was laid down in a shallow nest. The gun pit was putting out steady, rhythmic bursts, keeping the German Alpine troops from crossing the open shale. But then, a mortar shell landed directly on the position. The explosion was a blinding flash of orange and black. The machine gun stopped. Its crew collapsed in the debris, the weapon itself miraculously intact, but abandoned. Felo lunged forward to reach the gun and restore our line of fire. But before he could lay his hands on the spade grip, another mortar shell detonated on the rock ledge. The blast threw him backward. He crashed chest first against the jagged rock, a heavy groan escaping his throat. Under the weight of his fall, I heard the sharp metallic crunch of the silver watch cracking in his tunic pocket. He tried to rise, but his right thigh was shredded, dark blood pooling rapidly in the snow. And then I heard it, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of German mountain boots on the loose scree just above our ledge. I reached into my cartridge pouch. My fingers fumbled against the cold canvas. Empty. I opened the leather pocket on my belt. Only 3 clips left. 15 rounds. That was all that stood between us and the bayonets of the Gebirgsjäger. Stas was shaking, his MAS-36 pointing at the sky, his eyes locked on the clouds, unable to fire a single shot. "Stas, shoot!" I screamed, but he was gone, lost in the terror of the open mountain. I fired 3 rounds at a pair of gray windproof jackets rising from the rocks. The bolt clicked. The spring in the clip was cold and stiff. I shoved my last clip into the guide, pushing the 5 rounds down with my thumb. The metal bit into my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. Not yet. The Germans were advancing in pairs, their gray jackets blending with the mist and the stone. They had Karabiner 98K rifles, and they had plenty of ammunition. Their MG-34 was laying down a continuous sheet of fire, chewing the stone ledge above my head into gray dust. "We're dry, Felo," I screamed over the din. I'm down to my last 4 rounds. Felo looked at me, his eyes dark under the rim of his helmet. He knew what that meant. Without ammunition, we were just targets. I made a choice there I've never told anyone. Until now, I looked out across the open ground. 20 yards away, in the middle of the rocky draw, lay 2 dead German Gebirgsjäger. They were slumped over a low boulder, their gray rucksacks still strapped to their backs, their leather cartridge pouches full of 7.92 millimeters Mauser clips. The ground between us and them was completely bare, swept by the crossfire of the German machine gun and our own retreating squad. It was a shooting gallery, and I was going to be the target. It was chaos, but the alternative was waiting here for the final rush, with nothing but a 3-sided French bayonet against a wall of lead. I didn't wait for Felo to order me. I dropped my pack, keeping only my MAS-36 and my bayonet. I threw myself over the ledge, sliding down into the slush. The cold mud filled my mouth and eyes. I crawled on my belly, dragging my body forward with my elbows, my steel-studded boots scraping uselessly on the wet stone. Every time the MG-34 fired, the bullets snapped inches above my head, chipping the stone and showering my back with granite grit. The smell of burnt cordite and wet wool was suffocating. I reached the first German soldier. His face was turned to the sky, his eyes wide and clouded by the cold. His gray jacket was soaked in dark blood that had frozen into a stiff crust. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely open his leather cartridge pouches. I tugged at the straps, my fingers slipping on the wet leather. Inside, the metal clips of 7.92 millimeters ammunition gleamed in the dull gray light. I pulled them out, stuffing them into my pockets, into my shirt, anywhere they would fit. I grabbed his carabiner 98K rifle. It was heavier than the MAS-36, the wood stock scarred by rock slides. I still don't know why I looked back at the ledge. I'm not sure I want to. As I turned, a mortar shell screamed down, landing with a deafening roar right on our crevice. The shockwave lifted me off the ground, throwing me against the dead German's boulder. The air was sucked from my lungs, and for a few seconds, there was only a high-pitched ringing in my ears and the taste of sulfur. When the smoke cleared, I scrambled back to Felo, ignoring the machine gun fire that kicked up the slush around my heels. I fell to my knees beside him. The snow beneath him was stained deep red. The broken face of the silver watch had slipped from his pocket, its glass shattered, the tiny brass gears scattered like golden seeds on the blood-soaked ice. The ticking had stopped. The hands were frozen forever at 4:12. Felo was coughing blood, his hands clawing at the frozen stones. Felo's face was gray, the color of the wet stone. The blood was pumping from his thigh in thick, dark spurts, soaking the snow around him. He was bleeding out. "Janusz," he whispered, his teeth covered in red foam. "Leave it." The gun. I didn't listen. I pulled my bayonet and sliced through Felo's long, tough leather bootlaces. They were stiff with ice, almost frozen solid. I dragged them free, my fingers raw and bleeding as the frozen leather cut into my wind-chapped skin. The pain was sharp, like needles of ice under my fingernails, but I pulled the laces tight around his upper thigh, twisting them with a piece of dry birch branch I found in the slush. I told Stas I'd get him home. I had no idea what I'd have to leave behind to do it. The tourniquet bit into Felo's flesh, slowing the flow of blood, but he was still fading fast. His eyes were rolling back, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. I looked around. Stas was still huddled in the crevice, his face buried in his hands, completely broken. The German mountain infantry were climbing the slope, their silhouettes clear against the white snow. They were less than 100 yards away. I had to make a choice. I could carry Felo down the steep, icy slope of Hill 275 toward the medical tent near the beach. But he was a big man, a heavy mountain boy from Zakopane, and dragging him meant leaving the FM-2429 light machine gun behind. If I left the gun, the Germans would take the ridge, and our entire company's retreat would be cut off. If I stayed to man the gun, Felo would die here, freezing in the slush. The heavy French machine gun was sitting on the ledge above us, its loader dead, its magazine still half full. It was a tool of steel and wood, cold and indifferent. Felo was my friend, the man who had shared his last trioxane-heated cup of water with me. It was the hardest decision of my life. That should have told me what kind of man I was becoming. I looked at Felo. I looked at the gun. I grabbed Felo by the collars of his heavy sheepskin jacket. I hauled him onto my back, my knees buckling under the weight. The pain in my shoulders was immediate, a burning ache that felt like hot iron. I left the French machine gun on its bipod, silent and abandoned. We began the descent. It was a nightmare of ice and stone. Every step was a battle against gravity. My steel-studded boots slipped on the wet rock, my knees shaking with exhaustion. Felo's blood ran down my neck, warm and sticky, freezing as it met the Arctic wind. Behind us, the German mountain troops reached the crest. I could hear their shouts, the sharp cracks of their rifles, and the lead whining past our ears, but they didn't pursue us down the steep slope. The fog was rolling in from the fjord, thick and white, swallowing the ridge and hiding our retreat. We stumbled into the lower ravine, where the remnants of our battalion were gathering. My lungs were burning, my legs numb. I collapsed into the slush, Felo falling beside me. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the gray sky. We had survived the counterattack, but the hill was gone. The stones of Hill 275 belonged to the Germans now, and all I had to show for it was a pocket full of German ammunition and a dying man's blood on my hands. We huddled in that freezing ravine until the gray light of morning began to creep over the cliffs. The fjord at dawn was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the skin on the back of my neck prickle, waiting for the sky to split open. The only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the Royal Navy ships sitting out in the gray water, their hulls like iron coffins floating in the mist. We had spent weeks looking down at those ships from the cliffs of Ankenes, watching them exchange fire with the German batteries. Now, they were just idling, waiting to carry away what was left of us. I sat on the edge of the shale, my fingers curled around the cold steel of the Carabiner 98K I'd taken off that German Alpine soldier on Hill 275. My own MAS-36 lay somewhere back in the dirt, its firing pin broken, its magazine empty. The French rifle had been a piece of clean, polished pride when we left France, a promise that we were a real army again. Now, it was just junk left in the Norwegian snow. I looked down at my hands. They were black with grease and dirt, the skin split across the knuckles from the rock. Stas was sitting next to me, his back pressed against the stone ledge. He wasn't looking at the mountains anymore. He was staring down at his boots, his breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs. Stas had always hated the open heights. In the salt mines of Wieliczka, we had 300 meters of solid earth above our heads. Here, there was nothing but the cold wind and the threat of German planes. "They're calling us down, Janusz," Stas muttered. His voice was thin, like paper left out in the rain. "The whole damn brigade, we're pulling out." I didn't believe him at first. We'd spent weeks freezing on these ridges. We'd dragged our bodies up the steep slopes of Hill 275 under the nose of the German machine guns. We'd watched our friends roll down the rocks like sacks of wet coal. And now, just when the Germans were backing off, when we had the town of Narvik in our sights, the runners were coming up the line with the evacuation papers. It felt like a sick joke. We had won the heights, but the war was being lost somewhere else. A British liaison lieutenant, his trench coat stiff with frozen salt spray, came scrambling over the shale. He only looked at Corporal Felo Dombrowski, who was lying in the dirt with his shattered leg, wrapped in the wool of his own Podhale cape. "All forces to the beach," the lieutenant said. He spoke English with that clipped, dry tone that made everything sound like a grocery list. "France is falling. The German tanks are through the lines at Sedan. We're leaving Norway. Sedan. The word didn't mean much to a miner from Wieliczka, but the look on the lieutenant's face did. The Allies were retreating. The whole grand campaign we'd crossed the North Sea for was just a footnote in a bigger disaster. More than 20,000 men were converging on the city of Narvik and the surrounding fjords, and now all of us were being ordered to run. We had bled for every inch of this black stone, and now we had to give it all back. We had exactly 6 hours to clear the harbor before the Luftwaffe bombers returned to finish off the fleet. It was already past noon. Stas looked at the water. "We're going back to the sea," he whispered. "Into the open boats." I stood up, my knees cracking like dry pine branches. My boots, their steel studs worn down to smooth, rounded stumps on the stone, slipped on the wet shale. "Get Felo," I said to Stas. "We're moving." Felo didn't move. His hand was clamped over his thigh, where the leather laces I'd cut from his boots were dug deep into the flesh. Acting as a tourniquet, the bleeding had stopped, but the leg was already turning a dark grayish-green at the edges of the wool. His wet cough bubbled in his throat, a thick, rattle-like sound. "I'm glad you left that damn FM-2429 machine gun up on the ridge, Janusz," Flo croaked, his face pale against the dirt. "We could never have made this descent carrying that iron monster." Stas nodded in silence. Leaving the heavy weapon behind on Hill 275 felt like leaving our last piece of pride, an admission that we were no longer a fighting unit, just a line of broken men trying to find a boat before the bombers came back. And then I heard it, a low, hollow whistle from the ridge above us, too high to be the wind. It wasn't an artillery shell, it was just a German scout signal, a bird call that didn't belong in the Arctic peaks, telling the German Alpine troops that the Podhale Rifles were finally leaving the high ground. They weren't rushing us. They didn't need to. They only had to wait for the ships to pull us off, and then the rocks would be theirs again. We had spent weeks fighting for Hill 275, Hill 650, Hill 773. Now, we were handing them back like a key to a locked door. Stas and I hauled Felo up, his arms heavy over our shoulders, his bare foot, wrapped in a bloody rag, dragged in the snow. The weight pulled at my shoulders, my muscles burning from weeks of hunger. Every step down was torture. The slope was steep, a drop of stone that wanted to throw us into the fjord below. The melting ice got inside our socks, freezing our toes. The scrape of our boots echoed against the rock. My boots slipped. I fell to one knee, the Carabiner 98K clattering against the rock. The wood of the stock nicked my cheek, the cold oil on the receiver smelling of old grease and German dirt. "Hold him," I growled to Stas. Stas was shivering, his ear scar turning purple. He was looking at the vast fjord, his breathing short. He held onto Felo's arm with a grip like iron. "I got him," Stas whispered, though his knees were shaking under the weight. "I got him, Janusz." Felo let out a low groan, his breath smelling of the bitter water we'd been drinking from the melted snow. "Easy on the leg, boys. Zakopane Mountains were never this slick. In the Tatras, the stone is dry. It doesn't try to kill you when you're down." He was trying to joke, but his eyes were glassy, staring at the gray expanse of the water below. We could see the Fjord from here. The water was still, a dark mirror reflecting the black clouds. But there was a stain on that mirror, a thick, greasy smudge of black oil that stretched for miles along the shoreline, drifting from the spot where the ORP Grom had gone down. My brother had been on that ship, a fireman down in the boiler rooms, tending the fuel lines and the oil burners while the German planes circled overhead. I had seen the ship explode and sink, a memory that would remain burned in my mind forever. The sight of the bow pointing at the sky, and then the slow, cold spread of black oil washing up on the rocks. I hadn't found his name on the lists the British officers brought to the beach. I hadn't found anything. My mother's face kept flashing in my mind, her eyes dark and hollow like the entrance to the salt mine back home, waiting for her 2 boys to return. "Don't look down, Stas," I said, pulling Felo's shoulder higher. "Just look at the next stone." We kept moving, our boots scraping against the dark stone. Every time a stone rolled loose and went bouncing down the cliff, my heart jumped, waiting for the crack of a German sniper's rifle from the ridges above. We were exposed on the open face, target practice for any German marksman who wanted to waste a round. Felo's cough got worse. I could feel the heat of his fever through his tunic, a dry, burning heat against the freezing wind blowing off the sea. We passed other squads descending the slopes, men from our brigade, their Mlay 26 Adrian helmets tilted forward against the wind, their faces gray and hollow. Some carried empty rifles, others carried nothing at all. The white lead eagles painted on their helmets were chipped and dirty, the paint peeling away to show the dull French steel beneath. We looked like a line of ghosts walking down to the shore. I had promised myself I'd bring both my brother and Felo back to Wieliczka when this was over, but the mountain had already torn that promise to shreds. The beach at the foot of the hill was a madhouse of gray water and wet sand. British landing craft were lined up in the surf, their engines roaring and sending up plumes of white spray. Sailors in heavy blue sweaters shouted at the soldiers, shoving them into the boats. The smell of burning diesel and wet sand hung heavy in the air. A medical station had been set up under a large canvas tent that flapped violently in the wind. The sand around the tent was stained a dark, rusty brown. Medics in dirty white aprons were moving between the stretchers, their hands red with blood that froze as soon as it touched the air. We laid Felo down on a wet canvas stretcher near the entrance of the tent. He groaned, his head rolling back, his eyes fixed on the gray clouds. The leather laces we had tied around his thigh had bitten deep into the flesh, the skin around them purple and cold. A British doctor, his face pale from lack of sleep, knelt down beside him. He took one look at the leg, then at the leather bootlaces I'd tied around Felo's thigh. He pulled a pair of shears from his pocket and snipped the leather. The laces, stiff with dried blood and ice, snapped with a dry sound. "Who did this?" the doctor asked, not looking up. "I did," I said. "You saved his life," the doctor muttered, his fingers pressing into the graying cold flesh of Felo's thigh. "But he's losing the leg. The shrapnel shredded the main artery, and this tight leather strap is the only reason he didn't bleed out in the snow, but the cold and lack of blood have killed the muscle. We have to amputate to keep the gangrene from setting in and taking his life." Felo reached out and grabbed my sleeve, his fingers digging into the wool of my tunic. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man who had lost so much blood. "Janusz," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "Don't let them leave me. Don't let them leave me here with the Germans." "They won't leave you, Felo," I said, though I didn't know if it was true. "The hospital ship is British. It's heading to England. You'll be out of the snow." "England," he spat, his voice cracking. "I don't know any English. How do I tell them where it hurts?" The medics lifted the stretcher, carrying him inside the tent. I wanted to follow him, to hold his hand while they did the cutting, but a British sergeant grabbed my shoulder and shoved me back. "Out, Private," the sergeant barked. "This station is only for the wounded. Board the transports. The boats are leaving." Stas was standing by my side, his eyes fixed on the empty sand where Felo's stretcher had been. He looked lost, his hands twitching at his sides. The open sky of the beach seemed to crush him, his head bowed as if he were waiting for a blow from the clouds. "He's not coming with us," Stas said. "No," I said. "He's going to England. We're going to the transport." "And what about your brother Janusz?" Stas asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the landing craft engines. "What do we tell his mother?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I looked out at the fjord, at the dark stain of oil that still drifted on the water. The ORP Grom was gone, and my brother was somewhere beneath that oil, In the freezing dark of the fjord, the British sergeant shoved us again, his hand rough on my backpack. "Move, you bloody Poles. The last boat is loading now. We don't have all day." We waded into the freezing water, the surf coming up to our knees, soaking our boots. The cold was a sharp, biting pain that made my breath catch in my throat. We climbed into the landing craft, the steel floor slick with salt water and sand. As the ramp came up, the engine roared, pulling us away from the shoreline. I looked back at the beach. The medical tent was a small white speck against the dark, towering rock of the hills we had fought for, the hills we were leaving behind. The landing craft bounced over the waves, throwing us against the steel sides. Stas sat in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, his head tucked down. He was safe from the sky now, but he was still shaking. The transport ship, a large gray British coal freighter, loomed ahead of us. Its sides were rusted, covered in salt crust and soot. We came alongside, the landing craft pitching wildly in the swell. A rope ladder hung down the side of the ship, slick with spray. "Up!" the sailors shouted. "Get up the ladder!" I grabbed the wet hemp rope, my hands so numb I couldn't feel the fibers biting into my palms. It was the easiest climb I'd made in weeks, yet every foot I gained felt like a descent into something worse. The hold of the transport was dark and smelled of coal dust, bilge water, and sweat. It was a damp, heavy cold, far different from the clean mountain air. We sat on the iron floor. The hold was crowded with men huddled for warmth, our uniforms steaming in the dim light of a few bare bulbs. The engine below us started with a heavy, rhythmic thrum that shook the iron plates beneath my seat. It felt like the salt mines of Wieliczka, the same dim light, the same damp air, the same feeling of being buried alive under tons of rock. But in Wieliczka, the walls were solid. Here, there was only a thin sheet of rusted steel between us and the freezing depths of the Arctic Ocean. Stas sat next to me, his head resting against a steel pillar. He had stopped shaking, but his eyes were wide and blank. "We're alive, Janusz," he whispered. "Yeah," I said. "But we didn't win," he said. I didn't say anything. I looked down at the German Carabiner 98K across my knees. The wood was dark walnut, worn smooth by the hands of the Alpine soldier who had carried it. It was shorter than my MAS 36, heavier, but it felt solid, a tool made for killing in the rocks. I had kept it because my own rifle was gone, and because I didn't trust the British to give us new ones. I'd tell the officers it was a battlefield pickup, a necessity. But the truth was, holding the rifle that had almost killed my squad was the only thing that made me feel like I was still in control. A Polish officer, a second lieutenant with his uniform torn and dirty, came walking through the hold. He stopped in front of me. "Kowalski?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. He looked at the German rifle on my knees, then at my helmet. "Where's your MAS 36? "Left on the hill, sir," I said. Firing pin broke. He sighed, making a mark in his book. "Keep the German weapon if you have ammunition for it. We don't have anything to give you." I looked at my helmet, which lay on the steel deck between my feet. The white lead eagle painted on the front was almost gone. The shrapnel from the mortar strike on Hill 275 had scraped across the brass plate, tearing away the white paint and leaving only a jagged gray scar on the dark French steel. The eagle had no wings now. It was just a smear of metal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, flat tin of trioxane heating tablets. It was empty, but beneath it, my fingers brushed the small lump of Wieliczka salt, now half crumbled and damp. I left it there. Instead, my hand closed around a stray chunk of coal I'd picked up from the iron deck of this British coal freighter, a loose scrap fallen from the boilers below. It was dusty, leaving a dark smudge on my fingertips. I stared at the black mark on my skin, wondering if the coal would outlast the lie I was about to write. I needed to write to my mother. The Red Cross was supposed to take letters from the transport ship when we reached Great Britain, sending them through Switzerland to occupied Poland. It was the only way she would know if we were alive. I found an empty cardboard box of British rations in the corner of the hold. I tore off the label, the cardboard rough and yellow on the back. I sat back down on the iron floor, balancing the cardboard on the wood of the German rifle stock. The coal in my fingers was small, a stub that was hard to grip with my stiff, cold fingers. I wrote her name, Helena Kowalska, Wieliczka. Then I stopped. My brother, Tadeusz, he had been so proud when he got his uniform for the ORP Grom. Now he was gone. I had seen the ship explode, a huge column of fire and black smoke rising from the fjord. I had smelled the burning oil that drifted up the cliffs. I knew there were no survivors from his section of the ship. If I wrote the truth, it would kill her. She was alone in Wieliczka, with the Germans occupying the salt mines. She had only the letters from her sons to keep her going. But if I lied, she would spend the rest of the war waiting for a man who was already at the bottom of the sea. She would look at every ship list, every Red Cross report, hoping for a name that would never appear. I looked at Stas. "Stas," I said, "do I tell her about Tadeusz?" Stas didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his boots. My father always said a lie is a debt you pay later, but he never saw a ship burn. I looked down at the yellow cardboard. The coal was ready. I decided to write the lie. "Tadeusz is safe," I wrote, the letters thick and black from the coal. His ship was hit, but he was taken off by a British destroyer. He is in England now, in a hospital. He has a wound on his arm, but he is recovering. Do not worry about him. The words looked ugly on the cardboard, the coal smudging as my fingers trembled. It was a clumsy lie, but it was all I had to give her. I wrote about myself. I am fine. We are leaving the mountains. We are going to England to rebuild the brigade. The winter is over. I signed my name, Janusz. I folded the cardboard label in half, hiding the black letters inside. I would give it to the mail officer when we reached the deck. I leaned my head back against the steel hull, the cold metal biting through my hair. The engine's thrum was louder now, the ship rolling slightly as we entered the open sea. I looked at the German rifle again, the Mauser 98K. The safety catch was flicked to the right, the bolt locked. A weapon of the enemy, now my only protector. The hold was quiet. Most of the men had fallen asleep, their bodies slumped against each other, their breathing a heavy, collective sigh that filled the dark space. Stas had closed his eyes. His hand had stopped scratching his ear. I sat there in the damp hold, the cardboard label tucked into my pocket, my hands resting on the cold steel of the carabiner. My helmet sat between my feet. The eagle scraped raw to dark French steel. The mountain was behind us. The salt mines were far away. We had survived, but as the ship rolled on the dark waves, I knew the weight of that survival was something we'd carry long after the snow had melted.